Sega brings honor at last to the Master System on Segaiden episode 66.
They could never tear us apart.
You never really see Kenseiden lifted up as an all-time classic, as a fan favorite, as a game worthy of memorialization. But in some ways, it kind of seems like the Master System has been leading to this moment. I was speaking to an acquaintance recently, because as we all know, I don't have friends, and they said something to the effect of, Master System feels like a console that fell out of an alternate reality where the NES and Famicom never actually happened. And most of what we've seen so far on Segaiden bears that out. For every rare zillion designed in the style of a console or computer classic, we've seen a dozen or more games that landed on Master System with the unforgiving brevity of a product designed to sit in arcades. You can tell that Sega tuned the games that appeared on Master System in its first 2 years of life for challenge, crafting them with the mindset of extracting payment from players every 2 to 3 minutes. Never mind that home console games don't work that way, and that consumers pay their entire entry fee up front. Sega approached gaming from the perspective of a coin-op vendor, simply because that's literally all the company had known before its move into the console space. Honestly, that makes Sega pretty unique among all console creators in Japan, and pretty much one of a kind worldwide outside of Atari. Sega's console rivals in the SG-1000 era consisted of toy companies like Bandai, Nintendo, and Tomy, an educational publishing company with Gakken, and consumer electronics companies Epoch and Casio. All of these companies had dabbled in making video or electronic games of some sort before they made their bids for the console biz, but only Nintendo had properly dipped a toe into Sega's home turf with a string of coin-op cabinets. And while the likes of Donkey Kong resulted in the greatest financial windfalls Nintendo had experienced in nearly a century of doing business, the company never fully embraced the amusement vending world. On the contrary, Nintendo had defined itself as a toy maker first and foremost. Not only did their hard-earned understanding of kids' play patterns drive the design of their video games, the company all but abandoned arcades as soon as their console established itself. After launching 1985's Punch-Out spin-off, Arm Wrestling, Nintendo almost exclusively treated arcades as an advertising platform for its console titles. The Versus system and PlayChoice 10 lines saw Nintendo release dozens of titles into arcades, but the PlayChoice system in particular simply existed as a paid demo unit for new NES titles, which meant that kids could play huge, rambling, console-style titles like Metroid and Super Mario Bros. 2 in arcades, their paid experience metered by time rather than lives. No, Sega had more in common with America's Atari, the company that created the entire concept of coin-op video games in the first place. Atari treated its 2600 console as a pipeline for its arcade hits, while also dreaming up all-new arcade-style titles for its home machine. But even Atari tackled the realities of home gaming more directly than Sega did at first. Its releases may have revolved around 3-minute play experiences, but most Atari titles came wired with multiple, sometimes dozens of, alternate play modes to allow home consumers to mix things up and tackle games on their own terms. Perhaps the best known of these efforts was Atari's take on Space Invaders, which took tremendous liberties with the look and cadence of the arcade game, but made up for it with a huge selection of remix modes that threw in surprise considerations, like invisible invaders or missile bases. It was not only a chance for people to play the arcade hit at home, a compelling pitch in its own right, but also an opportunity to experience it in ways that the coin-op cabinet simply couldn't deliver. Sega hasn't really taken that approach on Master System so far. Its library feels staunchly rooted in the arcade mindset of the early 1980s, again as though the NES and its library of long-term play experiences like Zelda and Metroid had never happened and weren't million-selling hits. And there's certainly something to be said for the purity of Sega's approach, as we saw last episode with their faithful 2-player conversion of Double Dragon. The company clearly hoped to position Master System as the top choice for game lovers who wanted truer arcade conversions than Nintendo offered, for fresher games and sporting nicer visuals than Atari could dish up with its 7800. But ultimately, no console can succeed by homing in on a single section of the audience. Not only does that approach alienate anyone who wants something different, the reality is that kids only have so much money to go around. When you focus on a single group of customers, you eventually drain their allowances. And Sega has certainly shown signs of exploring Nintendo-style game experiences that pair arcade-like pacing with the depth of computer gaming. Aside from the most obvious example of the form, Zillion, we've also seen the excellent Penguin Land and the oddly addictive Maze Hunter 3D. And some of Sega's arcade releases didn't really need retuning to work on consoles. Wonder Boy and Monster Land and the Fantasy Zone games stand out as coin-op creations that introduced the depth and nuance of home games into arcades, which in turn made for excellent home experiences with minimal design tweaking required. But Sega has only rarely retooled its arcade conversions to embrace the nature of consoles. We saw Shinobi a few episodes ago, where a fairly simple adaptation, trading out single-hit kills while removing the protagonist's invincibility to weak attacks, was precisely what the game needed to feel ideally suited for home play. But games like that and Quartet, which shifted from a side-scrolling gauntlet-alike to a more exploratory quest game on Master System, have been few and far between on Sega's console. Which is kinda weird when you think about it. For some reason, Sega of America left a bunch of Mark III games that neatly hit the console experience mark overseas. I can understand why Sukeban Deka 2 remained stranded in Japan. It bore a license for a TV series that never reached the US. But why did only Europe get a localized version of the puzzle-like Zelda Druaga hybrid Pit-Pot? No, Master System has largely been defined by strange behind-the-scenes choices, made both here in America and back in Japan. But the good news is that Kenseiden has arrived at last, so I can finally stop hammering on this point. With Kenseiden, Sega demonstrates once and for all that it does indeed understand how console games work and what home audiences want. Kenseiden doesn't upend the console race or anything, but it hits the spot, and it represents a fundamental sea change for Sega's approach to the Master System in America. From this point on, we'll see far fewer arcade ports to this console, and far fewer games that grasp for that coin-op flow. In their place will be more adventuresome games with greater depth and more forgiving difficulty curves, and games that generally just feel like a direct attempt to break the Nintendo console hegemony. Oddly, this happens to coincide with Sega's decision to retire the Mark III in Japan. As Kenseiden arrived in the US in October 1988, Sega launched the 16-bit Mega Drive in Japan and pretty much immediately put the Mark III to bed. Only 2 games would ship for Mark III from this point, a port of Ys and Activision's Bomber Raid. There's an irony to this. The kinds of games we'll see on Master System going forward would have done really well in Famicom's home market, but Sega clearly decided to cut their losses and focus entirely on 16-bit releases in Japan. Not that this really ended up helping the Mega Drive's fortunes there, but oh well. There should be little question that Sega looked at the Famicom with Kenseiden and said, let's do some of that. I mean, you can still see some of their rivalry with Namco bubbling through here. With its oversized samurai protagonist swinging his sword wildly at yokai while battling through horror-tinged images of feudal Japan, Kenseiden almost feels like it wants to be to Genpei Tomaden what Shinobi was to Rolling Thunder. And that's actually pretty smart Famicom counter-programming, since Namco's own Famicom conversion of Genpei Tomaden ended up taking the form of a board game, rather than directly adapting the strange multi-scale arcade original to that underpowered hardware. Ultimately, though, I'd say that Kenseiden's similarities with that game begin and end with its aesthetics. Ultimately, Kenseiden wants to be Castlevania, and frankly, it's hard to criticize that ambition. Now, Castlevania never quite hit in Japan the way that it has in the West, but it still did well enough that Konami created a bunch of sequels to it, some of which never came to the US, and well enough that plenty of other developers borrowed liberally from its design. Some simply tried to capture its cadence and precision, as with the NES version of Ninja Gaiden, while others were less subtle. Thinking Rabbit's 8 Eyes and Sega's own Vampire Master of Darkness, just to name a couple, were straight-up riffs on Castlevania and offered no apologies. Of all of these games, Kenseiden might be the most successful. You can definitely see the Castlevania influences here, with the protagonist's precise movements and short-range attacks and need to climb stairs to get about the world. But at the same time, Kenseiden has its own personality. Besides the whole yokai thing, which is just Castlevania's Universal Monster movie theme shifted a few hundred years to the east, it plays distinctly. It also, notably, falls somewhere between the original Castlevania and Simon's Quest in terms of structure, which I suppose means this might be the world's only clone of Vampire Killer for MSX. It doesn't quite go full Vampire Killer here, with most levels taking a fairly linear approach to progression, but Kenseiden does throw in a lot of moments where you need to stop and look around in order to advance. It's packed with secrets and options, too. Stand on top of a Buddha statue, and you may find yourself entering a secret room. Enter the optional training grounds, and you could win yourself some permanent power upgrades for protagonist Hayato. Not that I recommend that course of action. The training rooms allowed the anonymous Sega designers who developed this game to really bring their arcade sensibilities to bear. They're absolutely brutal gauntlets that demand perfect execution and a whole lot of memorization. The rewards are worth the effort, since they permanently increase Hayato's defense and offense, and are more or less mandatory for the later bosses. But after grinding through the first training space for 20 minutes without being able to reach the end, I accepted defeat and made peace with the fact that my Hayato will always be a samurai weakling. And that's okay, because Hayato does learn permanent skills in the course of completing the mandatory portions of the adventure. Every time you defeat a boss, you learn a new combat technique that comes into play later in the game. The first boss, for example, grants you a skill that allows you to perform high jumps, which immediately come into play in the second set of stages when you encounter high platforms and long gaps over deadly magma. The skills also include things like rising sword strikes, which means Sega played a lot of Zelda 2 for inspiration here as well. Kenseiden takes place across more than a dozen Japanese provinces as Hayato wanders from territory to territory in order to strike down all manner of ooky-spooky monsters. Yokai spawn constantly from all directions, often attacking in ways that Hayato struggles to defend against. The minor rabble working in concert to whittle down his health, to put him at a disadvantage against the bosses that await at the end of each set of provinces. But here's the thing that really sets us apart from previous Sega action titles. Hayato has a lot of stamina. Most enemy attacks only do minor chip damage, and you can usually find or earn a health refill in each stage. This means that as long as you play precisely and avoid getting sloppy with your movements and attacks, you have a pretty good chance of making it quite a ways into the game on your first go. Now, will you make it to the final boss even if you find the diary scroll that allows you to continue after running out of lives? Well, no, probably not on your first attempt. But you're likely to get far enough into the adventure to feel like you have a real chance of reaching the end with more practice, and maybe by mastering those training chambers. This is a very compelling hook for a console game, and something that has been generally lacking in Sega's Master System releases, which have taken a pretty ruthless approach to difficulty with no compunctions about killing you in seconds after launching into a new game. Kenseiden is the real deal, an interesting action game with a sizable quest, a hero that grows more powerful as you advance, and just the right balance between challenge and forgiveness, all in an original work for Sega Master System. It really feels like Sega's designers have finally twigged to the needs of console game design here. Belatedly, but better late and all that. We're well past the sophomore slump of summer 1988 and moving into an era of good, original, compelling releases for Master System. A turn of events that doesn't just make Master System more appealing to a wider audience, but also sets up Sega for success in the incipient 16-bit era. What did Sega Challenge say? Nothing. Because apparently, Sega's marketing and Sega's developers weren't on the same page yet. Next time on Segaiden, set the controls for the Heart of Algol.